Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Your presenters today will be Alexis Romano, Sarah Peterson, and Puki Chu, and of course myself, Dimitri Travis Ambrose. So today, our topic is going to be on a roadmap for or to decarbonization of existing buildings in emerging US cities. We were able to complete 6 case studies and spoke with city policymakers to determine key decisions that must be made during this process. We also created a roadmap and timeline for cities to use while implementing successful policies to achieve building decarbonization. Now, it's important to recognize that buildings are entities that consume copious amounts of energy energy for their daily operations. And on a global scale, they can generate up to 20% of the total annual global CO2 emissions when compared to other sectors, according to Architecture 2030 and data from the International Energy Agency of 2022. To start again, as an introduction, it's important to recognize that buildings can generate up to 20% of the total annual global CO2 emissions when compared to other sectors, according to Architecture 2030 and the EIA, or the International Agency of 2022. Now, this 20% will be the target of our practices and policies that we'll be discussing today. So in May of 2022, JLL, a global consultant and research firm, released a report titled Decarbonizing Cities and Real Estate. And within this report, it states that the contribution of buildings to citywide carbon emissions has a median value of 60%, based on the audits of 32 cities, 32 global cities that partake in the report. Now, of those 32 cities, at least 7 of them are US cities and 3 are depicted here. You'll see Chicago at the top at 52. Just below that is Los Angeles at 41. And a few down from there is New York City at 66%.
Yeah, so after recognizing that this is a very large amount of emissions coming from cities specifically, we decided to look at some real data that was put out there, as well as some scorecards and some reports that were put out already in this industry. So the ACEEE scorecard, which is the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, played a major role in our background research. And after doing that, we kind of dove into a few other things along with building data that was already in the industry. So the Institute for Market Transformation had already been implementing some strategies that could be used for building decarbonization, but they hadn't actually put out a report similar to ours, but it definitely was a key resource when we were doing our background research.
Now we want to explain our methodology for creating a policy roadmap. So again, we are using the ACEEE scorecard. It scores and ranks the top 100 cities with its building policies, and we divide that into 4 quartiles. The 4th quartile, we define that as pioneer cities. Pioneer cities have the most comprehensive building policies for the decarbonization. And the 1st quartile, we define that as emerging cities. And our goal is to create a repeatable roadmap for emerging cities to learn and adopt building policies from the pioneer cities. And we researched 13 cities for their building policies and listed out all the building performance drivers, such as new and existing buildings, equity, resiliency, supply chain and circularity, finance and data. And we also consider commercial and residential buildings. But because the scope is too large, and then we scope out like based on certain criteria, such as building operations. So our final scope, it becomes commercial buildings, existing building policies, equity, and finance. And then we picked 6 pioneer cities as our case studies. We deep dive into it by doing city interviews, city official interviews, reviewing the ordinances such as benchmarking, energy audit, building performance standards, and also study a lot for their city knowledge base, including the websites, brochure, meeting notes, published articles from the city government, and also from the nonprofit publications from IMT, city energy projects, etc. And then we learned from the best practices and created a 5-step policy roadmap to achieve long-term carbon target. So as you can see on the right-hand side, the roadmap, like we start with step 1, oversight, and then benchmarking, data verification, building performance standard policy co-creation, and the equitable implementation. And then you can see the car that represent finance, because you need finance throughout the entire roadmap.
Thank you. So that leads us into our first step, oversight. Now, we see oversight as the dedicated agency or entity who is responsible for all things building related. Now, pioneer cities like New York City and St. Louis, they have their Department of Buildings and building divisions respectively. And and within these agencies, they implement and enforce building policies. Unfortunately, a lot of the emerging cities that we saw, they lack this unifying agency. Now, a singular agency is responsible for helping to facilitate more effective and consistent multi-agency collaboration and cooperation, which can lead to direct lines of contact to budgeting and finance departments, to the Institute of Market Transformation, or IMT, as Alexis mentioned earlier, and city cohort groups. Now, overall, this step is intended to set the foundation to get from benchmarking to building performance standards. Speaking of building performance standard, benchmarking, I mean, that's our next step. And in benchmarking is basically the process by which specified buildings must measure and report their annual utility and building energy performance data. Now, currently, the common standard is to use the Environmental Protection Agency's Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Moreover, as a best practice, some pioneer cities have decided to implement the automation and integration of reporting utilities to Portfolio Manager. As a second best practice, I'm really blanking right now. Excuse me. As a second best practice, their covered building phasing is also implemented such that with time, the size and or unit threshold for buildings required is reported, and this is reduced in an effort to increase the number of buildings that are covered. An example of this can be seen here, where Boston's Building Emissions and Reduction Disclosure Ordinance reduces the threshold from 35,000 square feet or greater to 20,000 square feet or greater. New York City has their local law 84 and 84 revisions that reduce the threshold from 50,000 square feet to 25,000 square feet. And DC has their Clean Energy Omnibus Ambient Act that reduced the threshold from 50,000 square feet to 25,000 square feet, and then to 10,000 square feet. So benchmarking overall sets the baseline with automation and expanding building coverage through policy phasing.
And then step 3 is the data verification. Agreed by all city officials, third-party verification of benchmarking data is important for drafting the next ordinance. It helps understand energy consumption baseline and performance for each building type. And the best practice is that we learned is to have at least 60% of compliance rate of verified data for accurate analysis. And then next is the proper data management. Portfolio Manager basically is the de facto standard for collecting benchmarking data. And the data will be transferred to a centralized system with all the other data together. Seed and Touchstone platforms are the two software used in the case studies. Analysis and reports will be generated and hosted with visualization tools on city public websites. And building owners can check their compliance status there. The centralized platform also has a ticketing system for communications between the city agencies and building owners. And this platform is built as the initial foundation. When implementing future ordinances, teams can continue to build on top of this system for additional features and integration. And then step 4 is about building performance standard policy co-creation. Building performance standard is an outcome-based policy aimed at reducing carbon emission based on the target. As you can see in this table, there are some examples from our case studies. For example, New York City, it is aiming for target GHG emission per square foot per building type every 5 years. And DC is aiming for 20% energy reduction in the first compliance cycle. And to draft the ordinance successfully, creating a BPS task force is highly recommended. They're responsible for technical analysis and providing recommendations to the authority. It is important to have a diverse stakeholder groups represented from each community that will be strongly impacted by the ordinance, especially for equity consideration. It is also highly recommended to include a city council member to speed up the ordinance publishing process. And then next will be the metric determination. Choosing the right metric and threshold is one of the key design decisions for the ordinance. It is highly driven from the city climate policy objective. For example, if the objective is focusing on energy reduction, the city likely chooses weather normalized site EUI as the metric. And if the objective is emission-based, GHG emission per square foot may be a better fit. Each metric has pros and cons, and the metric recommendation will be provided by the task force.
Yeah, so once that building performance standard is in place, we obviously understand that there's a lot of things that come into this. That has to do with compliance pathways, having education and support. So all buildings understand what they're responsible for. Like really looking at this data and seeing who are low resource buildings, where are those underserved communities, and where will that additional support be needed. So that's where this review board comes in. They help with implementing this performance standard and understanding how to make it very equitable for everyone to meet these standards in the long term. So looking at this review board is, again, a community accountable. So they are there to support the community, and they are actually appointed by a community vote. And these will include key organization members that are really related to those under-resourced buildings. So they will help represent those frontline communities. They will determine some of the BPS standards. They will also be able to, if a building is appealing for the long-term target that they are trying to reach, this review board will document and look at all of that documentation that they're submitting to maybe get extensions, and also allow them to have some kind of funding, which one of the suggestions we'll talk about later is an equitable emissions fund. So this is, again, determined by the review board who's getting that money. So some of these compliance pathways, as we know, as Koki had mentioned, there will be some long-term targets. These underserved buildings may have difficulties reaching those targets. So making sure to include multiple compliance pathways specifically for those under-resourced buildings. As we can see here, we have some of our case studies that we studied, and the two main common themes that we saw in these were a prescriptive-based outcome, which is using interim targets, having that overall site EUI limit in the long term. And then the other one would be plan-based. So allowing for these buildings to put in their own plans and what are their actions that they're looking for to meet those goals. As we had mentioned before, having an equitable emissions investment fund, which will be funded by those payments for people that are not meeting that long-term goal. So that fund will be put into place for equity, making sure buildings have those resources, even if they're undersourced. And that also will be like a localized fund. So that is specifically coming from these compliance payments, and also will go directly to this BPS standard. So how do we determine these under-resourced buildings? This is driven by data outreach. So as we saw in one of our case studies, specifically Denver, they used GEM, which is Green Link Equity Map, which is real data that's used to determine, according to a few community indexes, really what the demographics, the health issues, where are these communities and buildings having issues. Community involvement is huge in this. We know there's a lot of organizations that can play a role in this and understanding those under-resourced buildings, and there's a lot of stakeholders, which again, can be part of that actual BPS implementation. So equity, as we've been mentioning in the past few slides, this plays a large role in implementing that standard. So the Equitable Emissions Fund will be able to fund energy audits for those low resource buildings, allowing them to understand what they need to do to meet those long-term goals. An affordable housing accelerator will also allow for technical assistance and give them those funding resources. And then additional education also plays a major role. This obviously is huge for the overall BPS standard, but specifically having outreach for these under-resourced buildings. And then allowing for exemptions and timeline adjustments is a huge thing for them. For example, St. Louis has a 6-year one for under-resourced, whereas the normal standard is 4 years.
So last but not least, we have finance. And why our work has led us to identify 5 common capital strategies that can be employed by cities. At the cost sharing level, these strategies include rebates, grants, and tax incentives. And at the financing level, they include commercial property assessed clean energy programs and green banks. Cost sharing initiatives encourage building owners to upgrade to energy efficient systems because they lower the cost of the investment. These incentives can either be at the front end, like rebates and grants, providing investors with the money at the time of the upgrade, or the incentive can be at the back end, like tax credits, which reduce the building owner's tax liability at the end of the year. In the example on the left, if a $3 million rebate was applied to a $10 million solar panel installation, the building owner would only need to come out of pocket for $7 million. If this installation was also eligible for an tax incentive, the building owner's net investment further decreases to $4 million. Our work indicates that coupling a rebate with a tax incentive is the most popular incentive path. We also observed that grants can serve as a useful equity tool. For example, in New York City, grants were awarded to low-income housing and environmental justice groups, allowing them to upgrade to more energy-efficient heating systems. A common theme that arose was that the most popular rebate programs run out of money quickly. But because rebates are funded primarily through a systems benefits charge, which is a surcharge applied to all utility bills, replenishing these rebate programs puts a significant burden on the ratepayer. Despite its shortcomings, cost sharing is an important first step in addressing the cost premium related to decarbonization. Cities should engage the state early to authorize and collect a system benefits charge from which rebates and grants can be dispersed. Where possible, cities should also supplement program funding with cap and trade revenue, and if the budget allows for it, also offer tax credits. Many cities have also established property assessed clean energy financing programs, which I'll refer to as PACE. Although PACE can apply to both residential and commercial properties, given the scope of the work, we only will be examining commercial PACE. Like any other loan, PACE uses borrowed money to pay for upfront costs related to capital improvements. However, unlike other loans, PACE is paid back through a tax assessment. PACE is pretty complex and has a lot of steps, but a very simplified overview can be represented here on the left-hand side of the slide. Let's start with the capital provider at the very bottom, who funds the upfront costs to the energy contractor. The energy contractor improves the property, and the capital provider is then made whole through a series of tax assessment payments, which either the property owner or the tenant, depending on the lease structure, repays. As shown in the diagram to the right, PACE allows for longer financing terms, which reduces the monthly payment and usually results in net positive cash flow. From the property owner's perspective, they don't need to pay any upfront capital, and the obligation is transferable upon sale. A recurring theme in our conversation with policy leaders is that PACE has some investment limitations. Firstly, it usually has a minimum loan size requirement, which means smaller, more localized projects don't qualify. And secondly, it doesn't work well with Fannie and Freddie-backed multifamily projects due to the mortgage consent requirement. Since most PACE programs use private funding, cities can set these programs up without encroaching on their own funds. Therefore, we recommend that cities engage the state during the first year to pass PACE enabling legislation. A green bank is a mission-driven financial institution that leverages public dollars to attract private capital. Green banks are an important piece of the puzzle because they address existing market gaps like those created by PACE. They do this in a couple of ways. First, they attract private capital through co-investment structures. Green banks are able to do this by providing lenders with credit support, either in the form of a credit enhancement in which the private lender is shielded from the first loss position, or through a loan guarantee. Because green banks can aggregate capital quickly, they provide a much needed scale to the clean energy market. This is important because it lowers the cost of lending, allowing for more affordable solutions. Moreover, green banks recycle capital quickly, meaning that after a loan is repaid, the initial capital is reinvested in another project, maximizing its total impact. As you can see in the figure to the right, on average, green banks return capital 3 times over the course of 18 years, whereas PACE financing only returns capital once over a similar time period. Setting up a green bank is a time-intensive process. Therefore, we recommend that cities start the process early by engaging champions like the Coalition for Green Capital. Over the last decade, the coalition has worked closely with policymakers all over the country to support green bank formation, including many of the cities we interview. Ideally, green banks should be operational before the building performance standard is announced so that capital is accessible to building owners immediately.
That brings us to our timeline. And taking into account these 5 steps today, we created this timeline, and this is the benchmarking phase, which incorporates oversight and data verification. Steps in this phase include, but are not limited to, designating the responsible agency, hosting stakeholder and public feedback groups, and drafting the ordinance, and lastly, data collection. So this phase can take up to 5 years. Our next phase is building performance standards. This also incorporates elements of oversight and data verification as well. Steps in this phase include, but are not limited to, establishing the BPS, the Building Performance Standard Task Force, analyzing benchmarking data, drafting the ordinance, and setting up the review board. This phase overlaps with benchmarking, and it can also take up to 5 years. Lastly, that brings us to the finance phase. Finance also incorporates elements of oversight, like the direct lines of contact to the budgeting agencies and finance departments to lead to steps like engaging the state to set up system benefit charges, local PACE legislations and setup, and green banks legislation and setup. This phase can take up to 6 years. Now, this depicted here is a view of our entire timeline, which has over 20 steps that a city can take to reach a functioning system to adhere to its climate goals. By our estimate, it would take a city close to 7 years to build a functioning system from scratch. Thus, we would encourage any city that has yet to take action to do so as early as possible. Thank you. We'd also like to thank the city agencies that we were able to speak with for taking the time to meet with us and give us their feedback. And we'd also like to thank Duncan, our advisor, as well, for sticking through with us till the end. Any questions?